Hi, I'm Paul Edwards, author of the Mourner's Woods books, and first and foremost, a monster kid. Tonight I'm watching Curse of the Undead from 1959, starring Michael Pate. Weird West is a whole subgenre of fiction, where stories are set in the American Old West, but have strong elements of either fantasy or science fiction or horror. You could trace Weird West stories back to a 1930s movie serial starring Gene Autry called The Phantom Empire, which was a cowboy set story, but the cowboy hero discovered, when he explored a mine shaft, he discovered a secret futuristic kingdom. And this sort of fiction popped up every once in a while through the 40s and 50s, usually in the form of pulp novels. In 1959, we had this example. Curse of the Undead is probably the first feature film that you could really call a Weird West story. Others followed, though. In fact, others were more commonly known. An example that almost everybody knows is the Clint Eastwood film High Plains Drifter, where Clint Eastwood is the ghostly, nameless cowboy who cleans out the town's bad guys after the town marshal has been murdered by them just a little bit beforehand. And, he's clearly the ghost of the murdered marshal. And Weird West flourished in other media too. There was a television series called The Wild Wild West, which ran for, I think, 4 seasons, which was a 1960s TV series where 2 Secret Service agents traveled the American Old West fighting against sort of far-out spy villains like mad scientists, secret assassins. There were characters who had doomsday weapons, things like this, all in an old Western setting. And Weird West laid its claim in comic books as well. In the early 1970s, there was a whole fad of weird Western stories. But Curse of the Undead is the first film that was really specifically a Western horror, as opposed to like a Western fantasy or science fiction. And what happens in Curse of the Undead is that Michael Pate plays a gunslinger who comes to a town where 2 warring ranchers are causing a lot of conflict. And Michael Pate's gunslinger gets involved in their drama. Strangely, some of the deaths that occur in this town are not gunshots at all, but are people who are drained of blood and have 2 small puncture marks in their neck. The movie does not keep it a secret from you for long that Michael Pate's character, the gunslinger dressed in black who operates at night, is actually a vampire. And the town becomes very suspicious of him when there are a couple of different gunfights where his opponent is convinced that he shot the gunslinger right in the chest and the bullet had no effect. So this story really has a good balance between horror elements and Western elements. It doesn't overdo the horror. There's enough horror in it. You see the vampire gunslinger concealing himself in his crypt and trying to keep the enemies off the scent of finding out who and what he really is. But it's not just a straightforward vampire film either. There's plenty of Western elements to it. And there's enough Western elements that if you wrote out the vampire part, you could make a workable story out of what was left. There's enough Western story in it to carry a complete movie, even if you took the vampirism out. But it's a really entertaining combination. I've always liked Weird West stories. It's a sort of a subgenre of horror fiction that has a certain appeal. There's another subgenre like that, and that is war horror stories. I could go on for a whole separate video about war horror stories. There's been combat comic books that focus on the horror aspects of war too. It's easy to picture war stories as being, either dramas or action adventure tales. But horror works very well in a war setting too. I can think of one specific example. If you ever saw the TV show from the 80s, Amazing Stories, which was a show that Steven Spielberg produced. It was an anthology show, kind of like The Twilight Zone. There was an episode of that where a little mousy guy was one of the troops that was going to storm the beach on D-Day. And against all odds, this little, unnoticeable sort of cowardly guy leads the troops in this amazing charge and smashes through the enemy lines and, saves the day. And everybody thinks that he's such a hero, and they go to look for him after the battle. And it turns out that he was one of the first who died when the troops were first landing on the beach, and he never even made it to the shore. So wartime ghost stories work very well. Wartime ghost stories and Western ghost stories are their own unique subdivisions, and they're each worth taking a closer look at. Listen, if you enjoy vintage horror and classic monsters, you would love my book series, the Mourner's Woods books. I'm self-published on Amazon. I've written a series of novels that take place in a haunted forest, Mourner's Woods, and I recapture the feel and the vibe of 20th century B movies, but in a contemporary setting. My books are the Mourner's Woods books. They're available on Amazon. My name again is Paul Edwards. Thanks for letting me talk to you some about Curse of the Undead. I'll see you in Mourner's Woods.